This is the theater of Frederick the Great. 14 years ago, it was blasted in the final battle for Berlin. Bronze Orpheus tries to play his lute, but it was shot out of his hands by a Russian Tommy gunner. Apollo tries to strum the strings of his lyre, but they were cut by the blast from an American bomb. The imperial line of Germany tries to roar, but its tail is broken. Since 1945, this monument to the German imperial past has lain in ruins, and over it has flown the red flag. For we are inside East Berlin, inside East Germany. The division of post-World War II Germany into East and West left about 53 million people in West Germany and 17 million in East Germany, as well as many problems, especially the problem of West Berlin. That part of Berlin under British, French, and U.S. control, which was 110 miles inside East Germany. This was Kurfürstendamm, the main business street of West Berlin. Goods from all over the Western world could be seen here. Most of the movies being shown in the theaters of West Berlin were imported from the USA. Mickey Mouse was in West Berlin, as well as Pinocchio, and hula hoop dolls were to be seen in the store windows. In 1959, the cafes of West Berlin were jammed with business people. New bank buildings were going up. The flag of the German Federal Republic, which we called West Germany, was modeled after that of the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. Horizontal red, black, and gold bars, with the black eagle of the Kaiser in its center. The old German police are back, modernized but with the same high-peaked caps. Alles in Ordnung, everything in order, is an old German motto. But not everyone in West Berlin sits around in cafes. There's a great deal of work being done. A large plan exists for the reconstruction of West Berlin. New buildings going up. The ruins from World War II being torn down. This makes for many jobs. The refugees who used to come over from East Germany through East Berlin, especially able-bodied men, knew they could get a job on one of these building construction sites. The work was hard, but they earned more than they could in the East, and could also buy many things that were not available in East Germany. Clothing, for example, was less expensive and of better quality in general in West Berlin and West Germany than in East Germany. And when the housewife went shopping in West Berlin, she could buy bananas, oranges, and other things which had been imported into the city. In East Germany and East Berlin, on the other hand, such exotic imports were very high-priced and often not available. Many Berlin families were also divided, often with the husband or wife working in West Berlin and their spouse in East Berlin. For every Westmark that was earned in West Berlin, one could buy 4 Eastmarks in one of the West Berlin change booths. Despite the reconstruction, in 1959 there were still many ruins in West Berlin. There had already been a great deal of apartment construction, but a housing shortage still existed there, and the typical rent was a quarter of the monthly wage. One of the most severe internal problems in West Berlin in 1959 was that of what to do with people who were too old or too ill to work. This is Clay Alley, the site of the U.S. Army headquarters in West Berlin. The U.S. garrison of a few thousand men was surrounded by a vastly superior number of Russian and East German troops. The Clay Alley headquarters had a big department store, post exchanges, and all the other things one would expect to see in a U.S. Army camp. Standing on a street corner there, it looked more like a town in Iowa or Illinois than West Berlin. In order to keep up the morale of the troops, various recreational events were put on. Saturday afternoon there was always a football game, U.S. style. These were the Berlin Bears, the U.S. Army team from West Berlin, playing the U.S. Army team from Frankfurt. Helmets, uniforms, balls, all brought over from the States. A typical newsstand in West Berlin. The newspaper headlines described Khrushchev's disarmament plan, which had been proposed to the United Nations. There were also certain publications on the newsstands of West Berlin and West Germany which bore more than a casual degree of attention. This was Der Lanzer, which meant G.I. Joe in the German sense. It was the title of a whole series of pocketbooks, 300,000 copies of which were sold every month. These books glorified the Nazi army in World War II. Titles such as Soldiers Fall in Heaven, How We Took Crete from the British were typical. Published in West Germany, they were made available in West Berlin at half price. A typical ad in one of the newspapers with swords and diamonds tells of a new series of books about the highest Nazi medal, the Knight's Cross. In this illustration, we see a Nazi soldier shooting a British underground radio operator. There were also veterans publications being sold in West Berlin and West Germany. The Steel Helmet and the Soldier's Journal were leading examples. Our Upper Silesia was a newspaper for refugees which demanded the return of Silesia, although it has been part of Poland since 1945. Maps are printed showing Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia and Poland as being stolen parts of Germany, and headlines cried, "Was Germany alone guilty in the Second World War?" This story in Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet, called for a general amnesty for all Nazi war criminals. But what of East Berlin? Back in 1959, there were various ways to get there from West Berlin. This was a typical crossing point, a bridge across a canal bordering on the American section of West Berlin. Guarding it was a West Berlin policeman. Before the wall dividing the city of Berlin was built on August 13, 1961, you could walk across this small wooden bridge and enter the Russian sector of East Berlin. A policeman from East Berlin stood just a few yards away from the West Berlin cop. Even before the wall went up in 1961, these cars were all being driven either by foreigners or West Berliners, because East Berliners and East Germans couldn't drive their cars into West Berlin. West German cars with West German licenses could enter and leave East Berlin. The most popular way to go from east to west or west to east back in '59 was on the subway, the U-Bahn, or the elevated train, the S-Bahn. Looking at this map of the city with the communist part in red, we see how the elevated trains went into and out of the zones. As of August 1961, all of the train lines stopped at the wall. This is the Zoological Garden station in West Berlin. According to the Allied military agreements signed at the end of World War II, all railways, elevated trains, and subways in West Berlin were controlled by the East German authorities. Thus, the East German authorities had the right to place posters like this one, calling for an end to atomic testing, inside the railway stations of West Berlin. Leaving the Zoological Garden station, we traveled through the Hansa Quarter of West Berlin, a very beautiful and modern district of expensive apartment houses. Off in the distance was the West Berlin Parliament Hall. The Parliament Hall was named the Benjamin Franklin Congress Hall and was built with U.S. aid money. As the elevated train rounded a bend, off in the distance we could see the ruins of the Reichstag, the German Parliament building. Burnt by the Nazis in 1933, it is now being rebuilt by the West Berlin authorities. As we pass the Reichstag, we cross over into East Berlin. This is East Berlin. There are still extensive ruins. This is the flag of East Germany. It is exactly the same as the West German flag, except that instead of the black eagle of the Kaiser, it has a socialist emblem in its center. But the bands of red, black, and gold are the same as those of the old Weimar Republic flag. One of the most well-known places for tourists to visit in East Berlin is the Soviet Garden of Remembrance, an enormous cemetery built by the Red Army for 17,000 of the Russian soldiers who died in the tremendous Battle of Berlin that took close to 1 million lives at the end of World War II. These double life-size bronzes depict an old man and young Russian soldiers mourning for their fallen comrades. Here are some typical tourists from the West: a French soldier, a U.S. soldier, a second lieutenant walking with his parents. Buses come over every day from the U.S. Army headquarters in Clay, LA to tour East Berlin. Dominating the Garden of Remembrance is this 120-foot-high statue of a Russian soldier. He holds a sword in one hand, there's a smashed swastika at his feet, and he cradles a little child in his arms. Looking down from the soldier, we see the 5 mass graves with the bronze laurel wreaths on them, where 17,000 Russian soldiers were buried. Flanking these graves were a series of marble bas-reliefs with various scenes depicting the German invasion of Russia in 1941, the defense of Russia, and the 1945 counter-invasion of Germany. The inscriptions on the sides of these bas-reliefs are by Stalin. Around the graves themselves are floral wreaths sent from all over the world by various groups sympathetic to the Russian soldiers that died here. This one is from the Communist Party of the United States. East German school children are taught a great deal about the history of World War II. Every day, busloads of them are brought to the cemetery and told by their teachers how the Russians liberated them from the Nazis. At the entrance to the cemetery, a large statue stands dedicated to the estimated 24 million Russians killed in the war. This is another type of monument, Stalin Allee. Built in an area that was completely bombed out, this boulevard of memorial-type buildings is about 2 miles long and was named after Stalin himself. Few East Germans liked Stalin Allee. The general feeling was that it was more of a personal monument to Stalin than something really needed by the working people of East Berlin. There were many stores in Stalin Allee, all of them state-owned. Although the goods in their windows had improved measurably in the last 3 or 4 years, even in 1959 they were still not up to the West Berlin quality. Across the street from those neo-Renaissance type statues around the sport hall on Stalin Allee stood a statue of Stalin himself. This day was the anniversary of his birth, but there was only one small floral wreath at the base of his statue. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, many changes had taken place. One of them was that the buildings now being built were more similar to Western-style architecture. Less ostentatious use of building materials, gayer colors, and no more useless ornamental columns and trims. The people were getting many more apartments than they used to get before. For the first time since 1945, more apartments were being built in East Berlin on a per capita basis than in West Berlin. 12,000 in East Berlin for 1 million people, 20,000 in West Berlin for 2,500,000 people. This is Alexanderplatz, the center of Berlin before the war. It was completely destroyed in 1945. By 1959, it had been 60% rebuilt. Unter den Linden, the most famous street in Old Berlin, in 1959 was still mostly in ruins. This was the gutted shell of the famous Crown Prince window. The Kaisers used to look out of this window and tell the people of Berlin of Germany's great victories. The ruined Church of Berlin, modeled after St. Paul's Cathedral, has been partially rebuilt. The Historical Museum almost completely rebuilt. This used to be called Berlin University on Unter den Linden. Completely rebuilt, in 1959 it was called Humboldt University, after Alexander Humboldt and his brother, famous German scientists of the 18th and 19th centuries. University students are given a stipend so they don't have to work while going to school. This means that even the son or daughter of a very poor family gets to go to university if they study hard and get good grades. The problem was that the salaries that one was paid after graduating from the East German universities was usually lower than those paid in the same profession in West Germany. As a result, there was a great temptation for someone graduating from a university in East Germany as a doctor or physicist to go to West Germany, where he or she not only had a different political system, but could earn a lot more money. Encouraging young people to stay on in East Germany and repay the nation for their subsidized education was a big problem. Construction work proceeded slowly in East Berlin. There was a plan whereby by 1962 or 1963, there would be a worldwide architectural competition for redesigning the entire city. Until that happened, attempts were made to beautify the gaping ruins. Lots filled with rubble were being cleaned up by these voluntary construction groups. Office and factory workers who would come out after their usual day's work was done to spend a few hours a week cleaning up the empty lots of rubble and planting grass and flowers. Not really professional gardeners, many came out to do this in order to lose a bit of weight, which had become quite a problem. In 1958, for the first time since the end of World War II, the per capita consumption of butter and sugar in East Germany surpassed that in West Germany. It's difficult to lose weight on this kind of job, however, when you're drinking beer. In 1959, at least 50% of the buildings in downtown East Berlin were still in ruins. A typical landscape site built by one of these voluntary construction groups brings up another contrast between East and West Berlin. East Germany, like all communist countries, was a complete welfare state. Pensions were provided for old people, and the state built old folks' homes. This was a brand new home for the aged in East Berlin. It provided free board and room and medical attention. The pensions available to the elderly, however, were still not adequate for all their needs. This old man was gathering scrap iron to earn a little extra money in order to buy a glass of schnapps in the evening, or maybe a portable radio or some other luxury item. The one group in East Germany that was really taken care of in 1959 was the children. Each family received subsidies for their first child, second child, and third child. A common saying was, Hans bought us the television set, Fritz bought us the washing machine. Nurseries providing warm meals were available to all children. In a playground in East Berlin built in the ruins near an old folks' home, the children appeared warmly clothed and healthy. They resembled their cousins over in West Berlin very much. When they got to be about 8 years old, the children of East Germany were encouraged to join the Young Pioneers. Then, when they got a little older, they were urged to join the Freie Deutsche Jugend, or Free German Youth, or some other of the various government youth organizations. For entertainment in East Berlin in 1959, you could go and see the Barley Circus, an exhibition of Soviet building machines, or a film like Secret Affair in Canton, or Shortly Before Midnight. The Sichuan Opera from China was in town, as was Natalie Karp, a British pianist. East Berlin had many theaters for a city of 1 million people. The most famous of all was the theater of Bertolt Brecht, the Berliner Ensemble. The symbol of the Berliner Ensemble was this design by Picasso, the peace dove and all the races of mankind. Bertolt Brecht wrote the famous Three-Penny Opera in 1928. A refugee from the Nazis, he lived in the United States during World War II. Returning to Germany in 1948, he died there in 1956 after having founded the Berliner Ensemble. Its most well-known play is Mother Courage and Her Children. Here are some scenes from that play. It is the story of a camp follower during the 30 Years' War of the 17th century. Mother Courage, with her 2 sons and her daughter, follow the armies as they battle back and forth across Central Europe. In order to make a profit from the war, they sell the troops boots and wine. One of Mother Courage's sons enlists in the army against her wishes, becomes a hero, and does a victory dance before his general, but he is soon killed. Her other son also runs away and enlists in an army. He steals the camp cash box and is executed while his mother hesitates about ransoming him. Finally, all she has left is her daughter. Her daughter, the only heroic person in the family, tries to warn the sleeping inhabitants of the village that they are about to be attacked. She beats on her drum. The soldiers try to drown out the drumbeat by chopping with a woodsman's axe. When this fails, she is shot. By the end of the play, 20 years have passed, the war still goes on, and Mother Courage has lost all of her children. She tried to profit from the war, but lost her family instead. A beaten and broken woman, all that she has left is her goods wagon. A very powerful anti-war play, Mother Courage has been performed not only in East Germany, but throughout West Germany, England, France, and many other countries. Next to Shakespeare, Brecht has been the second most performed playwright in Europe. An interesting thing about the Berliner Ensemble was that the actors were not only from East Germany, but also from West Berlin, West Germany, and as far away as England. East Berlin at night was certainly not as brightly lit as West Berlin, or Times Square. In 1959, most of East Berlin was still lit by pre-war gas lamps. By day, the city was bedecked with government slogans and banners. A typical banner declared, "Every week, one day of sport." There was a new government sports program, especially necessary because more and more people were working in offices and factories and not getting enough exercise. Old and young alike were urged to go out and spend at least one day a week doing some type of athletic activity. Badminton was popular. One of the most interesting things about athletics in East and West Germany was that although ordinarily separated, at the Olympic Games, East and West Germans played as one unified Germany. They used the black, red, and gold flag without either the black eagle of the Kaiser or the socialist emblem in its center, and accepted a total team score. South of Berlin is the city of Potsdam. This is the palace of Sanssouci. Nearby stands a statue of Frederick the Great, Frederick, King of Prussia. Sanssouci means without any troubles, and this is a very good example of the Baroque architecture of the early 19th century, the so-called Golden Age of the founding of the German Empire. The Palace of Sanssouci was captured by Russian troops in 1945. Fortunately, the Red Army lieutenant in charge knew of its cultural value and saw to it that no damage took place. The Sachsenhausen concentration camp
This is the flag
is located 30 miles
East
north
Germany,
of Berlin,
formerly
in the
called
vacation
the
town
German
of
Democratic
Oranienburg.
Republic.
It is exactly
held
the same as the West German
prisoners,
flag, except that instead of the
100,000
black eagle of the
whom were
Kaiser,
murdered by the Nazis.
it has a socialist emblem in its center. Among the remnants
But
of
the
what went
bands
on
of
here
red,
are
black,
these
and
old
gold
wooden
are the
slab
same as
doors
those
with
of
metal
the old
rims
Weimar
lying in the
Republic
mud.
flag.
The doors to the solitary confinement cells. Through these openings, the guards passed food to their victims. Through these peekholes, the guards watched as hundreds, perhaps thousands of people died behind each of these doors. South of Berlin is the death camp Buchenwald. Buchenwald was located a few miles from the town of Weimar. This was the electrified barbed wire fence which surrounded the concentration camp. This painting by a survivor shows what the camp looked like at the height of its activities, with hundreds of thousands of people jammed into it. The gallows have been preserved where the SS guards strangled their victims. This was the specialty of Buchenwald, the Nickschuss, or neck shooting place. The SS doctors would tell the prisoners that they were going to measure their height, but a rifle would then come through the rear of the measuring device and shoot them in the back of the head. Whether they were gassed, strangled, shot, died of typhus, or set upon by wild dogs, all of the murdered victims were taken to this little building with a big smokestack, through this wooden gate, onto these metal stretchers, and wheeled into these crematorium ovens. There was a saying that the only way out of Buchenwald was up the smokestack. In this dissecting room, the skin of tattooed patients was taken off to be given to Ilse Kosch, the wife of the commander of Buchenwald, to be made into lampshades. On this very spot, Ernst Thälmann, the communist candidate who opposed Hitler in the 1932 elections, after being held prisoner until 1944, was murdered. This tablet is dedicated to the members of the British and Canadian Armed Forces, who, after being taken prisoner in battle, were brought to this concentration camp and murdered. On the hillside overlooking the Autobahn leading to Weimar are memorial flames for each of the nations whose people died here. Sachsenhausen was very close to Berlin. This map shows that there were over 300 concentration camps and prisons inside Germany at the height of the Nazi era. How did this all happen? Let's go see Arturo Wie, a gangster spectacle by Bertolt Brecht, starring historical figures such as Hindenburg, Goebbels, Goering, and Hitler. Not as themselves, though, but as Chicago gangsters of the 1930s. The play begins in the produce market of Chicago. The vegetable syndicate is worried. The workers are striking and prices are falling. Meanwhile, in a penny arcade off the Loop, Arturo Wie and his gangster buddies are waiting for a chance to come to power. Arturo Ui had tried to do so by using force a few years ago, but was arrested and imprisoned. Now he has learned his lesson and declares, I will never try to come to power again unless I have the police and City Hall working with me, not against me. Dogsborough, the mayor of Chicago, accepts a bribe from the vegetable syndicate. Arturo Ui, the gangster, finds out about it and thinks that this is his big chance. He goes to Mayor Dogsborough and threatens to reveal the scandal unless Dogsborough lets him into the city administration and gives him police support. Arturo Ui rants and raves. Finally, he begs, but still to no avail. The people soon find out about the bribery. Demonstrations start springing up all over the city. Finally, in desperation, the vegetable syndicate gets Dogsborough, the mayor, to turn over power to Arturo Ui and his gangsters. With police protection, Arturo Ui's gangsters go out and shoot the strikers and other opponents. Slides are projected on the curtain between each act. This one says in 1933 the Reichstag, Parliament building, was burnt down by the Nazis. Hitler used it as an excuse for crushing the Communists, Social Democrats, and all other groups who opposed the Nazis. Here we see a parody on the Reichstag trial, with Arturo Ui's henchman Gero, Göring, as the chief prosecutor and Guy Volo, Goebbels, singing from the balcony of the theater. The old ham actor uses Mark Antony's address at Caesar's burial as a guide. The next time that Arturo Ui appears in public, he hypnotizes the masses. But there is trouble in the organization. Romo, the head of Arturo Ui's bullies, a parody on Rum, the head of the Brown Shirts, 2 million thugs who helped Hitler to come to power, wants to take over the police now. He says, I've done a job for you. Where's my reward? Things get pretty bad because Gero, Göring, doesn't like this, and he and Romo start pointing pistols at one another. Arturo Ui tries to get his boys together again. He sits them down and gives them a long, inspiring speech. He says, I'm the boss. Listen to me. Don't fight one another. Haven't I achieved success for us so far? But the trouble isn't over. Arturo Ui wants to make a deal with the boss of Cicero. He wants to extend the protection racket, which he has worked so well in Chicago, out to the suburbs. This is a parody on the takeover of Austria, what was called Hitler's Anschluss. The wife of the boss of Cicero comes to see Arturo Ui. She says, we'd like to do business with you, but we don't like Romo and the uncouth thugs around him. Get rid of them and we can work together. So on St. Valentine's Day, in a North Side garage, Arturo Ui takes care of the undesirable elements in his group with a machine gun. Just as in 1934, Hitler murdered Rom, his good friend, and disbanded the Brown Shirts. Dollfuss being a parody on Dollfuss, the premier of Austria in 1936. Just as Dollfuss was killed in the Bauhausplatz in Vienna by the Austrian Nazis and the Germans subsequently took over Austria, so in the play Dollfuss is killed and a big gangster funeral takes place. Before Dollfuss's body is put in the ground, Arturo Ui is already propositioning Dollfuss's widow for control of Cicero. The vegetable syndicate, however, doesn't like this. Say, Arturo Ui, Dollfuss was a prominent man like us. Why did you murder him? Arturo Ui replies, when you eat meat, you don't call the butcher a murderer. This desolate ruin in the center of East Berlin was all that was left of Hitler and his master race. It was the Führer bunker, Hitler's private air raid shelter. Built out of reinforced steel and enormous concrete block walls, 15 feet thick, it was several stories deep underground. This is where Hitler was going to fight to the end to defend his 1,000-year Reich. But in the last days of the Battle of Berlin, while 14-year-old boys and 70-year-old men were dying in the streets for what Hitler told them was to be the final victory, Hitler himself could no longer stand up to the possibility of being captured by the people whose families and countrymen he had murdered. So, together with his mistress, Eva Braun, he committed suicide. Their bodies were burnt, perhaps in this very spot outside the Führer bunker. These were the last scenes that would ever be taken of the ruins of Hitler's tomb. These trucks carried the broken pieces of buildings, bombed by the people who had been injured by Hitler, bombed as a result of the very policies that Hitler had hoped would give him power for 1,000 years. Then the rubble was dumped onto the ruins of Hitler's tomb, and the remnants of the tomb were smashed forever into the dust. These same workmen, German men whose hands operated Hitler's tanks in Europe, Africa, Scandinavia, and Russia, whose skills piloted his planes, killing people, now used their muscles to smash the last remnants of his inglorious tomb. Most ironic of all, the memorial park which the communists built over Hitler's air raid shelter was called Thälmannplatz, a square named after Ernst Thälmann, the communist candidate who opposed Hitler in the 1932 elections and who Hitler had murdered in Buchenwald in 1944. This is the site of the Ravensbrück concentration camp memorial. Ravensbrück was an infamous Nazi death camp for women, where 92,000 women were murdered. In 1959, people from 22 different countries came here this Sunday afternoon to dedicate a large statue as a memorial to the victims of the Nazis. Hitler's surgeons performed many illegal operations on the women in the Ravensbrück camp. Some of these mutilated women were brought to the United States after the war to see if something could be done to help them. Looking at the faces in the crowd here, we see many young people. These children, members of the Free German Youth and the Young Pioneer groups, were laughing and having a good time. Why not? It was a Sunday afternoon. They had learned about these things in school, but the past could have no real meaning for them. After all, they weren't born until years after the war ended. Even these nurses and young policemen, 19 and 20 years of age, were just babes in arms during World War II. They'd read about the concentration camps, but they couldn't really understand what they were like. But these older women were actually prisoners in the camp. And as they looked about them, they knew what these things meant, and they did not laugh. Now the crowd was at its height. 50,000 people assembled on a warm, sunny afternoon. One man held the flag of China over his forehead as a sunshade. A little boy scraped his knee running about, and it was being bandaged by one of the male nurses. This was the brass band of the People's Police. And they played the national anthems and marching songs of the 22 nations whose women were murdered here. Among the women were veterans of Hitler's terror from Norway. They carried flowers in their arms and the marks of their years of torture on their bodies. There were no graves around the camp, for the Nazis did their best to destroy all the bodies. The women placed flowers in those places in the camp where they had seen their comrades killed. This was the shooting alley, where the SS guards drove the women into a dead-end alley and then machine-gunned them. This was the wall of the camp. On it, the names of the 22 nations whose women died in Ravensbrück were mounted. Denmark, Germany, Holland, Norway, Austria, Poland, Romania, England, Greece, and France were among them. A wreath from Israel with an inscription on it in Hebrew stood before the wall. And even though East Germany did not recognize Israel as of 1959, the Israeli flag was also flown. This survivor of the camp wore the number that she had when she was a prisoner. This woman saved the striped jacket that she was forced to wear. Some of these women had not seen each other for 14 years since the day that they were liberated in 1945. At that time, most of them weighed 70 or 80 pounds at the most, and their heads were shaven. Now, healthier perhaps, but still wearing the scars of what happened to them, they meet again. Speakers from each of the 22 nations address the assembly. Soviet troops were stationed nearby, and one could see everything from privates to colonels throughout the crowd participating in the memorial. Catholic priests from many of the Catholic countries were also to be seen. A speaker from France addressed the crowd. Then a roar was heard as from far out on Lake Furstenberg a mortar fired the flag of each of the 22 nations high into the air. The flags descended by parachute to sink into the water as a final tribute to the 92,000 murdered victims of Hitler in this one camp alone. Hitler's tomb is smashed and gone forever. The monuments to his victims will stand for centuries to come. Sunday morning in Berlin, east or west alike. The city of Berlin has many lakes and rivers. Early on a Sunday morning, the Berliners paddle in their kayaks and canoes to enjoy the calm, still waters. Later on in the day, speedboats and motorboats appear. East Germany happens to be one of the major producers of motorboats and sailboats in Europe. It's hard to tell where a boat comes from, since most don't bear any particular insignia. This one, named the Karl Marx, was probably coming from the East Germany. Let's go on a cruise down the Spree River. This is the Muggelsee, a large lake in East Berlin. Nearby is the Grunau Beach, where the 1936 Olympic Regatta was held. These bathing beauties could be either East or West Berliners. The beaches in both parts of the city were open to the public. Before the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, people could cross over from east to west and vice versa to enjoy the sun and the water at their favorite beach. The beach is also a very popular hangout for teenagers. These fellows have long hair because it's the style of their idol, Elvis Presley. American culture has penetrated quite thoroughly here. There are restaurants all along the beach that serve everything from Apfelsaft, a kind of apple juice, to beer. Typical of the old traditions still practiced by young men throughout Germany and Central Europe, these teenage boys go off by themselves, no women allowed, to play cards, smoke cigarettes, and drink beer, thus showing their masculine quality. This outing was put on by the Free German Youth, one of the official East German youth organizations. Up until a few years ago, jazz music was considered decadent, but now the state radio provides a sound truck and the state youth organizations provide the jazz bands. Although until recently deemed decadent, jazz is now considered Afro-Cuban ethnic folk music, which came first to America and is now coming to Europe. As another part of the change in cultural activities of the Stalin-era years, even fashion shows are being held on the beach. We are on one of the Autobahns, constructed primarily for the purposes of transporting the army quickly from the eastern to the western fronts. Unlike American freeways, these freeways go around all the major cities, not through them. Bombed extensively during the war, the Autobahns have been rebuilt in both East and West Germany. There isn't much in the way of passenger car traffic to be seen in East Germany, mostly trucks carrying goods from one factory to the next. Although more passenger cars have appeared in the last few years, traffic is still sparse compared to the number of private cars in West Germany. South to the capital of Saxony, the city of Dresden. In the center of the city, many ruins still stand, gutted silhouettes against the twilight sky. This statue was melted out of shape by the heat from the bomb-caused firestorm. This is the rebuilt statue of August der Starke, August the Strong, the King of Saxony. Nearby stands the Zwinger, a famous building rebuilt at great cost by the East German government. As a historical gesture, they even put the imperial crown and cross back on the top of the monument there. As night falls in Dresden, the statue of August the Strong once more stands overlooking the city. The next morning, looking out over Dresden from a hilltop nearby, we see a panoramic view of the city. While there are still quite a few ruins, many buildings have been rebuilt in the old style, and here and there blocks of new modern style buildings are going up. One of the most beautiful structures rebuilt by the government was the famous Russian Church of Dresden, with its blue ceramic domes and golden spires. This was the Dresden Technical Institute, a world-famous school specializing in engineering and electrical studies. In its high-voltage laboratory are machines capable of generating sparks of 1, 2, and 3 million volts. The engineers put on a demonstration. The cafeteria for the students of the Dresden Technical Institute was designed by one of the architectural graduates of the school. As part of the general program throughout the communist countries of helping people from Africa and Asia become educated in modern techniques and the scientists, there are students from China, Indonesia, India, and many other underdeveloped countries. Leaving Dresden, we head west through Saxony. Passing ancient castles and fortresses on the hilltops, we proceed to Leipzig, often called the Paris of Germany. This is the enormous Völkerschlachtdenkmal, the monument to the Battle of Leipzig in 1815. It is dedicated to the 45,000 soldiers who died in the fighting when the Russians and the Prussians united to defeat Napoleon's French troops. In the streets below, there is a fair amount of auto traffic, strolling crowds of people, and a lot of reconstruction. This slogan on the almost rebuilt Library of Leipzig declared, "East Germany saves the German people from a new war." This typical Baroque fountain might be one of the very few things left undamaged by the war in this badly bombed city, or it could be a rebuilt fountain in the old style. It's difficult to tell because the restoration work being done was excellent. This is the literary department of Leipzig University in its old neoclassic style building. These posters, seen on buildings throughout the city, advertised the 1959 10th anniversary of East Germany, 10th Jahrestag der DDR. This one declared that joy, socialism, reconstruction, and peace have resulted from communism. This is a statue of Goethe. We're in the beer garden near Auerbach's Keller, famous because Goethe used it as the locale for the drinking scene in Faust. It's 5 centuries old, and the beer drinkers are celebrating its 500th anniversary. Around the corner is the old marketplace of Leipzig, the famous Nachtmarkt. Badly bombed, the center of Leipzig has been largely rebuilt, mostly in the old style. The restored medieval marketplace is bedecked with flags of the different nations participating in the annual Leipzig Trade Fair. While East Berlin is the administrative center of East Germany, Leipzig is its international trade center. This is the Hauptbahnhof of Leipzig, the main railroad station of the city. Before World War II, it was the largest railroad station in Western Europe, with space for 50 trains at one time. Completely bombed out, since 1945 it has been rebuilt and has once again regained its position as one of Europe's largest railroad stations. Each of its covered sheds holds 4 or 5 trains at a time. From the train station, we go to the main grounds of the Leipzig Fair. In the background, a large poster advertises the 1958 Spring Fair, which took place the previous year. This is the Wartburg, an East German-produced car, in back of which stands a Moskvich, a Russian car, and next to both of them is a brand new American automobile. A West German Volkswagen displays a Swedish license plate, and an American Chevy has a British license plate. Accentuating the international character of the Leipzig Trade Fair, the flags of China, Germany, and Russia fly together. Next to them are the flags of Syria and the United States. Over the flag of New Zealand, a Russian or East German jet plane leaves a vapor trail. Inside the first pavilion, an exhibition of hand-painted ceramic dolls from the Ural Mountains of Russia. The Chinese show their hero model fountain pen. Iraq has a photo exhibit, and Morocco sends the same carpet merchants who have been represented here ever since 1897. Austria, one of the biggest exhibitors, occupies half of a pavilion. These are the new sports model Wartburgs, two-tone convertibles. The people's car of East Germany was the Trabant, a 3-cylinder car made of plastic. For the ladies, there was a fashion show, with models from East Germany, West Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and France. The models walked about accompanied by a jazz quartet, part of the new lighter line in culture. A model from East Germany shows the latest in bedroom attire, while the master of ceremonies, complete with a bow tie, describes the garment. There were about 600 spectators and buyers at this event, and the jazz music continued throughout. A model from West Germany comes on. She looked very much like the East German model. They might actually have been sisters, because many families were divided by the division of Germany. This was a model from Paris. The latest fashion designs were still not available in East German stores in sufficient quantity to meet the demand. The models stood for an ovation. It was hard to tell from their hairstyles which country they came from. The streets of Leipzig were very brightly lit. In the department store windows were displays of the fashions in women's dress. Along with the dress designs was a display of political illustrations. This woodcut showed Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Occupied by thousands of foreign businessmen during some 4 months out of the year, Leipzig has many more entertainment facilities than most other cities of East Germany. The Femina Tanzbar was a very popular club, with 4 orchestras playing in it simultaneously. Auerbach's Keller of Goethe fame was also open to the public. In 1959, Leipzig was the only city in East Germany that had almost Broadway-like advertising signs. This one was for the Buna Chemical Works. VEB means People's Own Factory. This is the town of Eisenach, the city of St. George. Located close to the frontier with West Germany, Eisenach was a medieval town over 1,000 years old. Bombed during World War II, it was largely rebuilt in the old style. The old walls and narrow cobblestone streets still stand, and there are many ancient churches in the city. The most famous church in the Eisenach area is the Wartburg. It is where Martin Luther lived for several years during the 16th century. This is the pedestal where Bismarck's statue once stood. The main street of Eisenach was named Stalinallee, but unlike Stalinallee in East Berlin, here the old architecture was recreated. Eisenach, one of the oldest industrial towns in the province of Thuringia, was where the Wartburg car was built. It was interesting that the East German government named their automobile after the church where Martin Luther lived. This was a Czech Tatra, a rear-engine car. The statue of Martin Luther looked down on the traffic of this ancient city. As of 1959, the biggest development in East Germany was in heavy industry. Even though its population was only about 17 million people, according to U.S. figures, East Germany ranked 8th in the world in heavy industry and 4th in Europe. The basis of modern industry being electrical power, the main source of power in East Germany was brown coal. The East Germans were fortunate in this respect because their country had some of the largest brown coal deposits in the world. This was the Schwarze Pumpe, or Black Pump, mine, one of the largest brown coal mines in the world. It was serviced by these 500-foot-long excavating machines, said to be the largest pieces of movable machinery ever made. It is very wet and loose when compared to hard coal and produces only 30% as much heat in its natural state. Brown coal doesn't lie deep in the ground. Often it's only 60 to 100 feet down and can be mined by what is called the open-face method. Instead of digging tunnels, the overlying ground is removed and the coal is scooped up. Each of these giant shovels picks up 1/2 ton of earth or coal at a single bite. After the brown coal is mined, it is taken to a compression factory where it is squeezed and dried into blocks. This was the Black Pump's big new compression factory. When completed in a few years, it would treat brown coal by compressing and drying it until it became 80% as effective as black coal. After being dried and compressed, the brown coal was to be carried to the Lubino power plant. In construction since 1956, it was to be completed in 1965. In 1958, 50% of all the money invested in heavy industry in East Germany went into this one power plant, which, when completed, was to become the largest power generator in all of Western Europe. The Lubino plant had 7 smokestacks, each one 500 feet high. Down at the base of these smokestacks, there were women shoveling sand. This one, 18 years old, had been born in a farming community in the province of Mecklenburg. Her aunt lived near this power plant and had written her, "Why don't you come here? You can make 500 marks a month, about twice as much as you can make on the farm, and the work isn't much harder." So she'd come. A major problem facing the rulers of East Germany was getting enough skilled laborers like these steel riggers. The salaries paid in West Germany for such work were higher, and many were tempted to leave East Germany to live in West Germany for such economic reasons alone. In 1959, the West Berlin authorities estimated that 75% of the refugees who came over were for economic rather than political reasons. The traditional carpenters of Germany wear a broad-brimmed black felt hat and mother-of-pearl buttons on their jackets. Their hammers are stuck in the back of their belts. This carpenter was the chief of a smokestack construction crew. Looking like giant rockets getting ready for a trip to Mars or Venus, the stacks were being built by the poured concrete slip mold method. The concrete, arriving in these little trains, was taken to the base of the smokestack and then lifted up in a steel bucket to the top of the construction project, where it was poured into the walls. The machine that builds the smokestacks climbs up on its own work, so that only 15 men or so are actually used in the building of these enormous constructions. The chief of the crew asked if I would like to go to the top of the smokestack. Assuming that there would be an elevator inside, I said, "Fine, let's go." Much to my surprise, there was no elevator, only 29 wooden ladders, each one 20 feet high and about a foot wide. I started up, not realizing what I was getting myself in for. Each of the ladders was supported by a thin strand of rope at the top and bottom. There were safety nets on both sides so that you couldn't fall more than 20 feet at a time, except for the last 150 feet of the stack where there were no safety nets. The workers usually made it up to the top in about 15 minutes, but after 35 minutes I was still climbing. When I got about halfway up the smokestack, I could see neither the light from the top nor from the bottom, so the only thing to do was keep going up. Finally, after about 40 minutes, I reached the top. The last bucket of concrete came up and was poured by the carpenters. Looking out from the top of the smokestack provides an idea of the vast development that was going on here at the Lubino power plant.